Let's read the story of Jephthah together. We're in Judges chapter 11. Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead and his mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. "You're not going to get any inheritance in our family," they said, "because you're the son of another woman." So Jephthah fled from his brothers, settled in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. Sometime later, when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. "Come," they said, "be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites." Jephthah said to them, "Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we're turning to you now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you'll be head over all of us who live in Gilead." Jephthah answered, "Suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head?" And the elders of Gilead replied, "The Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say." So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them, and he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. Let me pause there for a second, because after this we get into this long dialogue between Jephthah and the Ammonites. He negotiates with them. We pick up the story in verse 29. "Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah, and he crossed Gilead and Manasseh and passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, 'If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering.' Then Jephthah went over to fight against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aroer to the vicinity of Minnith as far as Abel-Kiraim, and Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels. She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, 'Oh no, my daughter! You've brought me down and I'm devastated. I've made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break.' 'My father,' she replied, 'you've given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you've promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request,' she said. 'Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry.' 'You may go,' he said, and he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. And after 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. And she was a virgin." From this comes the Israelite tradition that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. This, too, is the Word of God. Well, we have been spending time in the book of Judges, and the book of Judges is a really sad book. The whole book is on this sad trajectory, or the sad spiral down into devastation and sin, and it just descends. You could say it descends down into hell. It's terrible. And this particular story is also a very sad story. It's sad in a whole bunch of ways, and as we're going to see, one of the things that is driving its sadness is that the main character, Jephthah, he's got a very twisted idea of his relationship to God. And because of that, all kinds of sadness happens. It's an important story, though, because I'm guessing that some of us also have a slightly twisted, torqued understanding of our relationship to God, and so there's things that we can learn from this story. I've entitled it Jephthah the Sad. We had Ehud the left-handed, Shamgar the stranger. Now we've got Jephthah the Sad. But I promise that it's not going to just end with sadness, that we're going somewhere in all of this, and that we can end with hope and perhaps even gladness. So let's jump into the story. We know from verse 10 that the people of God have been sinning. They've been putting God to the side, and they've been following other gods. And that's an important part of the story, because they've been serving all these other gods, including the gods of the Moabites and the gods of the Ammonites. So if you read the rest of the Bible, you discover that one of the important gods of the Moabites was a god named Chemosh, And Chemosh was a god that people sacrificed their children to. They would do child sacrifice. You can read about that in 2 Kings 2. In the Ammonites, they also had a god called Molech. And in Molech, they worshiped God in the same way. They would also offer human sacrifice to him. You can read about that in 1 Kings 11. It's not just that they did that way back in that part of the world. Human sacrifice has been a part of various religions all around the world, right? Including in some cases here in North America amongst First Nations people. So human sacrifice has been a part of lots of religions. And it's hard for us to get our heads wrapped around it. Child sacrifice for them was a kind of worship, sort of a part of their worship. And it was all about a worship where your relationship to God is one of negotiation. It's one of bargaining. And so it's sort of like, hey, God, look at this very difficult this radical thing that I do, and because I'm doing something so difficult and so radical, then you have to give me something back. All right? So we have stories like in 1 Kings 18 where the priests of a god called Baal, they cut themselves. Why are they doing that? They're like, look, God, look, I'm so devoted to you that I'm willing to cause myself harm. Will you then, you must answer me if you see that. And then the extreme form of that would be like, I'm willing to take one of my own children and sacrifice them. Or I'll take another human being and sacrifice them, that will please you, and then you will respond because you can't say no to that because it's so radical. So that's the kind of worship that the people of God were doing in the time of the judges. That's the kind of thing they were involved in. They were involved in this way of relating to God that was about negotiation, about bargaining, about getting God to do something for you. And the Lord doesn't like that. It says in the text, he's angry with them. He allows them to be oppressed. They're being oppressed from people in the west, the Philistines. They're being oppressed by people in the east, the Midianites and the Ammonites. And they cry out to God, and God's response throughout the rest of the book of Judges is that the people get oppressed. They cry out to God, and God sends them a deliverer. And this time they cry out to God, and what does he say? Well, why don't you ask one of your other gods? Like, you've been so devoted to all these other gods, ask them. I'm getting sick and tired of you, is basically what he says to them. And then they put away their other gods, and they call out to him, and then it says in verse 16 that he could not bear Israel's misery any longer, which makes you sound like God finally has compassion on them. You could also interpret it that he couldn't bear their hard work of trying to convince him any longer. Because he doesn't just, it says he couldn't bear their misery, but he doesn't give them a deliverer right away. He doesn't just respond. It seems that God is still sort of like, he's sick of them. He's like, I don't think that you're being truthful. I think that's not a bad way to read it. What's happening here is the people are spiraling down into utter chaos and destruction and human misery and evil, and the Lord's getting impatient with them. And he's not sending a deliverer right away. And so what do is they still don't have a deliverer, so they get together and they go try to find one, and they go find Jephthah. So Jephthah, he's a Gileadite. He comes from the east of the Jordan. He's probably from the tribe of Gad or Manasseh. And he's had a sad upbringing. His dad's name is Gilead, and his dad's got a wife and kids, but his dad also slept with a prostitute, and the baby that was born is Jephthah. All right? And so he's never really part of the family. In the ancient world especially, your loyalty always goes to your siblings who are of the same mother. So perhaps some of you know what that's like, right? Perhaps you have some half-siblings, and you see that loyalty tends to be in your family with children of the same mother, not the children of the same father. And so Jephthah, he's got some half-brothers, and they want to get rid of him. They're like, you're not one of us. We're not giving you any of the inheritance. Get out of here. They kick him out. They banish him. They send him off. Right? And so what happens, he goes off into the land of Tob, and he hangs around, it says, with a bunch of scoundrels. Basically hangs around with a bunch of criminals, and he becomes their leader. Basically, he joins a gang, and he's now the leader of the gang. And he's living out there. So he's had a difficult upbringing. He's discriminated against. He falls into this bad crowd. Now he's the gang leader. Well, that's sad. So I've called him Jephthah the Sad. He doesn't have a very good start in life. But then his older brothers and the other people from Gilead, they are getting oppressed, and it seems like they don't know how to fight, or they don't have any good leaders. And so what do? They're like, well, I know that Jephthah is the gang leader out in Tob. he seems to be like probably a pretty ruthless guy. He knows how to handle a group of scoundrels or a group of bandits. Why don't we get him to lead us? So they send people over, and they're really desperate, like, Jephthah, come and help us. You got to help us. So normally in the book of Judges, what happens is that you get a leader who arises to become a deliverer. And in this story, what's happening is that Jephthah is promised, if you deliver us, then you can become our leader. It's sort of, it's an unusual pattern. They get the banished brother, the son of the prostitute, to be their leader. And so he comes back, and now he's going to be the leader of all of the people. He gets to be the boss of his brothers and the boss of his whole people. Maybe Jephthah the Sad will now become Jephthah the Glad. Maybe things are getting better for him. Whatever it is, it doesn't seem that he's really God's choice. It seems like he's the people's choice, and that God has sort of been holding back and giving them a deliverer. Then we skip this part where he negotiates. He's a smooth negotiator. So he's not just a warrior, but he's a smooth negotiator. He writes this letter to the Ammonites, and basically he says, hey, you guys are claiming that we have to give you back our historical land, but he explains that was like 300 years ago. You don't have a valid claim to it anymore. Stop picking a fight with us. And he negotiates with them, but it doesn't work. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They don't listen, and so the conflict is going to happen. And then we read in verse 29, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. Now the Lord is intervening. Right? It doesn't seem like the Lord gave them Jephthah, but now that Jephthah's there, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. And in verse 32, it's the Lord who gives the Ammonites into his hands. So you could just pause there in the story for a moment. Sometimes things in the church of God, amongst the people of God, are going really bad. Sometimes things in your own family go really bad. Sometimes things in your individual life go really bad. But God's always at work, isn't he? The Lord's always at work. The Lord's at work in this story, right? Israel's doing all kinds of dumb things, and Jephthah doesn't seem like the chosen person of God, but the Lord's still going to work. What is he doing in this story? The Lord is preserving a church for himself. He's helping the church survive all of these difficult, dark ages of Israel's history so that eventually the Messiah can come. He's preserving the promise that he made to Adam and Eve and to Abraham, and he's preserving that all the way through. The Lord's at work, and the Lord's at work in your life too. Also, some of you have got very difficult things going on, and our church isn't perfect, and sometimes we wish that we could wave a magic wand and fix all of our problems, but God's in the middle of it. Praise the Lord that he's still working, he's still doing his work in the middle of our weakness. All right, that's worthy just to start. We could stop and sing a praise song right now, that the Lord is still at work. We're going to continue on, and we're going to get to Jephthah's vow, and that's in verses 30 through 31, where we read the following. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me, when I return in triumph from the Ammonites, will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. So, what is Jephthah thinking about? Some people think that he's saying, well, he's probably imagining an animal coming out of his house, because apparently some historians say that people would bring animals into their home at night, and maybe he's thinking about an animal. But it says someone who would meet me, or you could read it that someone would greet me. It's reasonable to think that Jephthah is thinking about whoever comes out of my house, not just an animal, but a person. That Jephthah has been worshiping other gods, and he's been having this twisted relationship to God where you bargain and you negotiate, and that human sacrifice could very well have been part of his life. Certainly he's trying to manipulate God. He's a smooth negotiator with God too. He's like, if I do this, if I sacrifice whatever comes out of my house, whoever comes out of my house, then you will save me from my enemies. Or if you save me from my enemies, I'll do that. I will show you how dedicated I am. We can bargain here. We can do this together. As if the sovereign Lord of the universe can be manipulated to do something, right? As if you as a human being, or Jephthah as a human being, can somehow do something that the sovereign God of the universe will be like, well, that obliges me. Now I have no choice, right? Psalm 115 is a psalm that compares God to other gods or idols, and it says, our God is in heaven. He does whatever pleases him. He does whatever pleases him. You can't make God do other things. You can't make a deal with God. You can't strike a bargain with God. You can't twist his arm, right? So that's an interesting expression in English. You'd be like, well, he twisted my arm. Like, he grabbed my arm and twisted it around my back until I was like, oh, okay, I'll do it. Right? And so we don't necessarily physically do that, but we negotiate or bargain with people. I'm going to twist this person's arm until they do it. Well, newsflash, you can't twist God's arm. His arm is a little bit bigger than yours, right? Just like if one of the little kids came up to me and said, oh, I'm going to twist your arm, Pastor Winston, and grab their arm and like twist it behind the back. I mean, I could control them with my pinky, right? It's ridiculous, right? They can't twist my arm. You can't twist God's arm. You cannot imagine a scenario where you could figure out to do something that God would be like, well, I guess I got no choice now. You're making me do it. Our God is in heaven, and he does what pleases him. His arm is bigger than our arm. Jephthah he's been affected by this worship of false gods. He's been affected by this idea that when we worship God, it's like I can twist his arm. It's kind of the idea of karma, isn't it? So karma says that, you get what you deserve, right? You do a bad thing, you get a bad thing. You do a good thing, you get a good thing. And oftentimes, also as believers, we can kind of think that our relationship with God is like that. It's like, well, if I do this, then God will do that for me, right? Or you can think about it a little bit like this way. You can think about like a vending machine. So you have a vending machine to get your Coke or your Pepsi or whatever it is. And so you put coins in the vending machine or you tap it, and then what happens? Something pops out the bottom. And sometimes we think about our relationship with God like that. Well, if I just do this, ding, or stick the coins in over here, if I say the right things, or if I do the right things, then clunk, God will give me this. For Jephthah, that was like, if I sacrifice what comes out of my door, if I even engage in human sacrifice, God can't say no. He's really going to go clunk, he's going to give me victory, which will make me the boss of all of Gilead. Right? But we can think about our own lives a little bit like that. Jephthah had a hard upbringing. He had a difficult childhood. You can have compassion on that. The saddest part of his story, though, really, is how he has such a twisted idea of how to relate to God. And the saddest thing is he didn't even need to do this. He didn't need to make a vow. The Spirit of the Lord had come upon him. Right? The Spirit of the Lord was with him. God was going to do what pleases God. God was going to bring victory to him. God had already decided who would win. And yet Jephthah is negotiating, bargaining, putting coins in the vending machine. He's trying to twist God's arm. He's got a twisted understanding of how to relate to God. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but maybe some of you, I know that some of you have made vows in your life to God. Vows that you feel like have sort of haunted you. You got to be careful with that. Right? You got to be very careful with that. Some people make vows when they're really scared and they're afraid they're going to die, for instance. They make a vow to God. Lord, if you save me from this, I'll do this. As if you can twist the arm of the most sovereign God. All right? So this past Wednesday, what day was it this past Thursday? What day was it? Halloween. Also, Reformation Day. Right? So it was a celebration of the Reformation, which has a lot to do with somebody named Martin Luther, way back in the 1500s. All right? And Martin Luther, he was a monk. And one time he was traveling and he was caught in a big, huge storm, and he was afraid he was going to die. Right? Afraid he was going to die. And so he made a vow. He made a vow to a saint, Saint Anne. And he said, Saint Anne, or he wasn't a monk yet. He said, save me and I will become a monk, he said. Save me and I will become a monk. Right? Maybe it's easier to twist the arm of a saint than it is to twist the arm of God. But that's what he was doing. Save me and I'll become a monk. And then he didn't die in the storm, so he became a monk. And then he studied the Bible as a monk. And then later on in life he said this: vows made to get something from God are futile, for God is sovereign. He recognized that his own vow way back then was silly. You can't twist the arm of God. He's sovereign. God doesn't relate to us like that. I used to live in Montreal, and in Montreal there is this huge church called St. Joseph's Oratory. It's the second highest dome in the world after St. Peter's Cathedral. It's gigantic. It's beautiful architecture. It's worthwhile to visit. And there's a big stone staircase going all the way up the hill, up to the front. And if you go there on certain days, you will see people climbing up those stairs on their knees. There are men, women, and sometimes children who will climb on their knees, may saying prayers all the way up the stairs. Why are they doing that? They're doing it because it'll show God how much suffering they're willing to undergo, how they're so able to give of themselves and even experience pain that the Lord won't be able to say no to their prayer. You can see that still today. It's the same idea. If I only make a vow, if I have this bargaining chip, this transaction with God. Now, maybe you're here and you're like, well, I've never made a vow, and I've never climbed up St. Joseph's Oratory on my knees, so I'm fine. But maybe you have thought in your own faith life, why are things not going well for me? Like I've been doing everything right. Like I've been a good person. I've been worshiping God. I come to Streetlight Church 2 times a Sunday. How come it's not going right for me? As if God owes you something, right? As if all of your good works have twisted God's arm and how come he's not responding? It's the same idea. It's the same idea. How come things aren't going very well? I've been putting all my coins into the vending machine. I've been tapping. I've been doing what's right, and it's not coming out. How come I'm not getting what I want? Basically, if you have thought that, or if you have moments like that, those are sort of moments where you have to wonder, if you're in that moment anyways, you're kind of worshiping a God of karma more than a God of, say, grace. I know that's happened in my life. I can remember a very distinct moment where that happened in my life. We were living in Mali, West Africa. In our youthful enthusiasm, we'd sold all of our worldly possessions and moved to Africa to help the poor. And then my wife, Barbara, got super sick. And life was really difficult, really difficult. She was struggling with very dark depression. She was in bed for lots. And then I remember being outside in our little courtyard one day and just feeling tired and feeling discouraged. And then praying, Lord, I sold everything that I had to help the poor, and all you gave me was a depressed wife, and I'm not getting any work done. What's up with that? You know, because God owes me all kinds of good stuff if I sell what I have and, help the poor. The Lord should be blessing me with all kinds of good things, and he certainly shouldn't make somebody in my family sick. It's karma thinking. Lord, I've been putting coins in the vending machine. You're not coming through on your side of the bargain. Lord, I've been willing to sacrifice whatever comes out of the front door of my house. You got to give me what I want. It's the same thought. We have to understand the God that we're serving. God does not help us because we are worthy. He helps us because he chooses to and because he loves us. The good news of Jesus Christ is never, I obey, I do this good thing, I do all these things, and therefore the Lord saves me. The good news is always the Lord saves me and loves me out of pure grace, not because of anything that I've done or do. And therefore, I follow the Lord and do what he asks. You have to get the gospel logic right. Jephthah didn't. Jephthah was thinking, well, if I do this, then the Lord will save us. But the gospel logic says, no, the Lord saves us by grace, by grace. So then I go out and live in gratitude to him. We must understand the God we're serving and understand the gospel logic of God's sovereign grace. God doesn't look at your report card and say, well, you got an above C+ average, so I'm going to do something for you. That's not the way that it works. You can't pressure God into giving into you anything. You cannot twist his arm. He's a God of sovereign grace. Ephesians 2 says, God has saved you by grace when you believed. You can't take credit for that. It was a gift from God. Salvation is not the reward for good works that anybody could boast. It's not you did these good works, therefore you get saved. It's you've been saved by God's grace. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah and decided that Jephthah would win. So then you go out and do good works. But Jephthah had it all mixed up. He had adopted the ideas of the culture around him. He had adopted false ideas of worship. What about you? What about me? So then what happens in our story? Well, Jephthah, he wins. Bam! Jephthah the Sad, outcast, born of a prostitute, leading a gang of criminals. He's now the leader of Gilead. He's the man, right? All of his brothers are recognizing that he's the man. So he comes home in victory, right? This is probably the best day of his life. He comes home in victory. He's feeling super glad. And who comes out of the front door? His daughter. His only child. His only child comes out. And now Jephthah is not just sad, but it says he's devastated. It's like suddenly his life just crumbles in front of him. He tears his clothes. He's like, oh no! What is happening? What is happening? His only child. He's completely devastated. He seems to obviously explain to his daughter somehow that this is what's going to happen. And then she's like, well, you promised it to God. Can you just give me some time to be alone with my friend? She seems to have the same idea. Well, he doesn't have a choice. Like you made this bargain with God and he's done what he said. You have to do what you said. Like that's how it all works. There is other options open to Jephthah here. Let's be clear about that. First of all, he could break his vow, bear the curse himself instead of making his daughter bear it. There's also in Leviticus 27, there was laws given by Moses to help you get out of vows that you made too quickly without thinking. So he could have done something like that. You see in 1 Samuel 14, I don't know, some of you remember the story when Saul is out fighting his enemies and he says, whoever eats anything before, we've destroyed our enemies, I'm going to take his life. Jonathan, his son, eats some honey. He didn't know about the vow. And so Saul's like, oh, I have to kill him now? And then all the people are like, no, you don't. That's not going to happen. And Jonathan is saved. There's ways out of it. There's ways out of his vow. But Jephthah doesn't choose them because he is thinking about his relationship with God as this tit-for-tat vending machine karma thing. I got to uphold my side of the bargain. That's how this works. That's how my relationship with God works. So his daughter goes off to mourn. And in verse 29 it says, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. And in the simplest reading, that means he sacrificed her. That he killed his daughter in child sacrifice in order to upkeep his side of his bargain with God. Now, some people believe that he didn't kill her. And the reason for that is they say, well, it doesn't say specifically that he killed her. And what's all this talk about her not being married? And, and it says that she was a virgin, so she didn't have any children. Like, what's all that about? So they think that perhaps he just banished her, or that she just had to live as a nun, basically, right? Had to live hidden somewhere. Although if she had to do that, then why does she need time to mourn with her friends? Like couldn't she just mourn when she was by herself, And it seems that this idea historically is born out of a big discomfort. Because obviously it's uncomfortable to talk about child sacrifice. And it seems so terrible and so bad. In fact, in the Middle Ages, what we found lots of stories, not found in the Bible, but lots of stories that people believed that what happened was he was going to kill his daughter, but then an angel intervened and saved her. So, I don't know, does anybody here like classical music? Some people like classical music. Handel writes a huge piece of music about Jephthah. He tells the story of Jephthah from Judges. And if you listen to that and you follow the story, in Handel's version, an angel comes and saves the daughter. Right? A lot of people, believe that would make the story nicer, make the story better. I don't think that's right. I think that if you read the text in the context of the book of Judges, that he sacrifices his daughter. It's very uncomfortable. And it's very sad. Jephthah the Sad. But it's what the book of Judges is all about. The book of Judges showing the people of God and the judges spiraling down the toilet. In the very end, they're going to become like Sodom and Gomorrah. In the very end, they're going to, instead of getting rid of all of the idol worshippers in the land, they're going to commit genocide against one of their own tribes. Horrific things are going to happen. Israel's judges in this story, Jephthah has become like the Ammonites. He's involved in child sacrifice. He's adopted the false worship of the world around him. And then we're going to get Samson come next. He's not exactly a stellar figure. He's not somebody that you'd model your life after. And then the book's going to end with saying, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Jephthah sacrifices his daughter. He's Jephthah the Sad in a book that's very sad. And the book ends, of course, saying they need a king, which is pointing in the first place to King David, who does come. He's a good king. It seems like they're spiraling down, and now they're spiraling up. It's getting better. But if you keep on reading, it goes back down again. Right? If you get into 2 Kings, in 2 Kings 17, the king of Israel and the people of the land, the king of Israel and the people of land do child sacrifice. In Jeremiah chapter 7, it talks about how the kings of Judah also engage in child sacrifice. You want to know something? You want to know where our word hell comes from? The word hell comes from the valley of Hinnom. The valley of Hinnom, or sometimes it's called Gehenna. Right? The valley of Hinnom, or valley of Gehenna, is a word, that's where our word hell comes from. It's talked about in Jeremiah and other places. There's a valley outside of Jerusalem where the kings engaged in child sacrifice. And it was the valley of smoke and fire, which is also our imagery of hell. It was a place where the worst of things could happen, where people would offer their children in sacrifice. Jephthah, you could say, is part of this downward spiral into hell, into the valley of Hinnom, into Gehenna, into hell. He's doing the worst of things. And if we join the false worship that Jephthah engaged in, if we involve ourselves in a quote-unquote religion that tries to twist the arm of the sovereign God, that tries to make plea bargains with God, that tries to say, well, God's like a vending machine. If I just feed him these coins, or if I just tap my credit card, then he's going to give me something. If we're interested in karma more than grace, well, we're in the same downward spiral. It's the same spiral. It's a hellish spiral. If you have other ideas about God, if you have other ideas about God sort of like this big grandfather in the sky, and he just is always just loves me no matter what I do, so I can lead my life however I want, and I don't have to follow any of his commands, but he just is always like big thumbs up and smiling and give me candies. All of your false ideas of the worship of God, your false ideas of God, are all part of the same downward spiral into the valley of Hinnom. Fundamentally no different than what Jephthah is doing. Now some of you are like, man, this is a good title for the sermon, because this is a sad sermon. Like, where's the good news? This is just all like bad stuff. I'm feeling sad already myself. The point of the end of the book is that they need a king. Obviously, they don't need just a King David. They need a king of kings. The point of the book of Judges and of so much of Scripture is that it's all pointing is that we need a better judge. We need a better king. We need Jesus. That's what this story in the end has to point us to. The book of Judges points us to Jesus. And praise God for Jesus, because what does Jesus do? Does he sacrifice other people? No, he sacrifices himself. Does he place others into the fires of Gehenna? No, he's crucified, dead and buried, and he descends into the valley of Hinnom. He descends into hell. Now, some people have said, yeah, there's not really that much different, because isn't that no better than Jephthah is cosmic child abuse. The father is sacrificing his child, Jesus, into hell. That's just a big misunderstanding and a forgetting that God the Father and God the Son and God the Spirit are three persons who are one God, and that in the covenant of redemption before all time, they decided from the beginning to save sinners through the sacrifice of Christ. And so Jesus says in John 10, nobody takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord, and I have the authority to take it up again. See, Jephthah cries out, oh no, and sacrifices his daughter, and she dies. But God the Father, Son, and Spirit before time said, oh yes. And Jesus said, oh yes, I will sacrifice myself so that others can live. So that others can live. So that we don't sink down the toilet drain into the valley of Gehenna. That instead he might raise us up to new life, to heavenly life. We don't need another Jephthah the Sad. We need a Jesus the Christ. And so today we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Friends, this is not a table of karma. This is not a sacrament of karma. It's a table of grace. It's a table of grace, and then as we leave it, gratitude. This table does no way is somehow bending the cosmic arm of God as if we could do so. It's no vending machine. Well, we'll do this and then you'll give us this. If I only vow this. There's no manipulation at this table. There's no bargaining. This is not about us doing something so that God will do something. This is us celebrating, remembering, trusting, having faith in what God has done for us out of pure grace. Pure grace. This table is so much better than the book of Judges. And there's hope in the middle of this story too, because you know what? Jephthah, he's mentioned one other time in the Bible. Anybody know where? He's mentioned in Hebrews 11. In the list of people of faith, along with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Boaz and Rahab and David. Jephthah, what in the world does that mean? How is Jephthah, with his confused, twisted idea of how to relate to God and his child sacrifice, how in the world does he get in the list of the people of faith? I kind of struggled with that this week as I was studying this text. But I think that there's hope here. And the hope is this. Jephthah is so not perfect. And he's really not a good example to follow. In all of his weakness, in all of his poor childhood upbringing, with all of his faults and his tragedy, somehow by God's grace, he's still used by the Lord for good. And that same sovereign God of grace who is able to use Jephthah, he can use you and you and you. And he can use me too, despite all of my weaknesses and my faults and the tragedies of my own life. God's grace is so surprising. It's so deep, and it's so wide, and it's so long, and it's so tall, despite whatever has happened in your life. Despite what your childhood and upbringing was like, despite the worst of your errors, despite your mixed up understandings and your bad vows, despite all of your errors and your misunderstandings in your relationship to God and how you understand Him, God in His grace, working through your weak faith, can use you for the good of the church. I stand here before you, and I almost don't want to say that, because I just want to put Jephthah in a box and say Jephthah is bad, and he descends down into the valley of Hinnom into hell. But I have to preach what Scripture says, and Scripture says this, that even someone like Jephthah is not beyond redemption. And even somebody like you is not beyond redemption. And God can use you. If God could write Jephthah's name into Hebrews 11 as a person of faith, then by God's grace, He can write your name in that list. And He can write my name in that list. And so we don't have to join Jephthah in sadness. We can join him in gladness. Amen.